I'm Rowan Williams, I'm a Master of Magdalen, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome you to this very auspicious event. I think today has been an extremely significant day in the development of one of Cambridge's most courageous and ambitious outward-looking projects. And we have an extremely distinguished panel to lead our reflections this evening, and we're very proud at Magdalen to have them with us. Very glad to welcome you here. And without more ado, I'll hand over to the Vice Chancellor, who's kindly introducing this session.
Master, dear colleagues and friends, students, it's wonderful to be here and a real honor for me to be with this panel. I do want to thank our host, the Master Fellows and staff of Magdalen College, and I know that for the Master, the issues that we're going to discuss are very close to his heart and to work that he has done over many years, so it feels very appropriate that we're here at Magdalen. I think it's a great opportunity to address one of the key challenges facing humanity in our age, perhaps in all ages, how to make peace and sustain it in really difficult circumstances. And we're going to have the benefit of two presentations by Prince Zeid Al Hussein, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Sir Stephen O'Brien, former UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. And I have to say that for us to have two such distinguished people here reflecting on what are some of the really great challenges facing the world will be, I hope, and I'm sure, fascinating and entirely engaging. And I think it's fair to say this is a really rough time for all of the issues that we're going to be canvassing. Before coming to Cambridge, I was working on a project on the future of human rights, and I have to say, reading some of the academic literature that is being produced right now, especially in Northern Europe and in the United States, would give one cause to think that there really is no future for human rights, that somehow we're at the end of time because of political developments, populism, the growth of nativism, nationalism. There's a real sense of despondency, I think, sometimes in the human rights community. And I think, unfortunately, that extends into the community of people working to address fundamental challenges of humanitarian relief and post-conflict reconstruction. But it seems to me that, frankly, we just can't afford to take that kind of hopeless attitude, despite everything, and it is a tough time. That seems to me the moment when academics and people in the field have to find ways of joining hands to try to figure out how concretely to make our situation better. So excitingly, as the Master indicated, Cambridge is taking an initiative to try to address all of these issues in a very outward-facing way. The Cambridge Initiative on Making and Sustaining International Peace. And I want to thank Mark Weller and all of his colleagues who've been working so hard to bring this to fruition. The network that is being created addresses a number of very important substantive topics: international peace negotiations, efforts to assist inter-ethnic and interfaith dialogue, post-conflict education, reconciliation, and transitional justice, post-conflict stabilization, humanitarian access, and the study of cultures of peace and of violence. That's a big agenda, but it's an important one. And I think there's already an amazing richness and depth across the university. And the hope here is, through the initiative, to draw all of that expertise together so that it makes it more visible, more accessible, and I think can contribute to the university's overall aim, which is to demonstrate how we make contributions to the most pressing challenges facing our generation. There's already a significant range of projects developing Cambridge-based expertise and offering support in delicate processes of negotiating and advancing peace in many parts of the world. The activities of the network have been in part conducted together with the United Nations. So it's so useful to have our two speakers this afternoon. There's a major Cambridge-generated resource on peace agreements and negotiating practice, which is now hosted by the UN Secretariat, about which we're very proud. And we're going to be strengthening links to other institutions and organizations through the work of the network. Some of the issues that have to be addressed are ones that are really quite fundamental, not only for post-conflict societies, but indeed for most societies around the world, including women's empowerment and transparency in peacemaking to allow people in communities to participate. Questions of legitimacy of government, legitimacy of processes confront many of us in many circumstances. The effect of the degradation of compliance with humanitarian principles. The fact that it's now seemingly acceptable to attack humanitarian workers with, sadly, seeming impunity in many circumstances. All of these have to be addressed by people of goodwill who really want to make things better. So back to my earlier point, it's just not a time to give up. It's not a time to say things are bad and we better step back and worry about our own situations. It seems to me exactly the opposite time. We're going to have lots of time for discussion after the presentation, and now it's my great honor to introduce our moderator, and I'm sure tough questioner, Lyse Doucet, the Chief International Correspondent for BBC World News. She's going to introduce our speakers in somewhat more detail and guide the discussions. Lyse, as you know, regularly anchors special news coverage from the field, including many conflict areas, and she's interviewed many world leaders. She played a key role in BBC's coverage of the Arab Spring across the Middle East and North Africa, and she's covered all of the major stories in the region for the last 20 years. She's a regular visitor to Afghanistan and Pakistan, from where she's been reporting since 1988. And of course, her reporting has earned her, along with other team members, an Emmy Award, richly deserved. So please join me in welcoming Lyse Doucet and our guest speakers. Lyse.
Ladies and gentlemen, good people of Magdalen College near Cambridge University, welcome. It is such a great time to be here tonight. Cold, rainy night in Cambridge, and yet here we are in this absolutely exquisite college, Magdalen College in Cambridge. Great time to be here, but not a great time to be here. Because why? Why would we be gathering for an initiative described as making and sustaining international peace if it wasn't outside these hallowed halls a pretty bad situation? A place of forever wars, we call them now, poisonous politics, intractable conflicts. And this, I would say, is the great paradox of our time. I often say we live at the best of times and at the worst of times. Never has our architecture for fighting for human rights and peace been any better. Human rights tribunals, big human rights agencies, brave human rights defenders on the ground, satellites in the sky, and eyewitnesses on the ground armed with their iPhones and YouTube. We know everything there is to know about when it's going wrong. Why is it then that we live in a time of rising right-wing intolerance, rising impunity, people getting away with it? We meet tonight because we want to change the balance. We want more to use what's good in our world, initiatives like this to bring all of the competences together, to work with peacemakers and peace builders and preventive diplomacy around the world, to make the bad of the world in which we live that much weaker. And but what a way to do it, and I must first thank my fellow Canadians, Stephen Toope. That's my greatest credential from being here. I'm from small town Canada, where we smile at everybody and are nice to everybody. It's the best way to begin. And obviously, His Excellency is a great moral voice still in our world today. We're very honored to have you with us. And what do we do ladies and gentlemen, when things go wrong? Of course, we call in the lawyers. We have two very distinguished lawyers with us tonight. Who here is studying law? Well, there you go. Look where you could end up one day. You students of Cambridge University. Sir Stephen O'Brien, graduate of Emmanuel College, became a lawyer, then he became an industrialist, then he became not just in politics, but an MP, not just an aid worker, but he became the head of Britain's development agency, DFID, went on to represent Britain in sub-Saharan Africa and Sahel, and then went on to lead the UN's most important agency for humanitarian affairs, the UN envoy for trying to tackle those humanitarian issues. And beside him, Prince Zeid Al Hussein, also a lawyer, who was not just a diplomat, but had held the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan's most senior diplomatic positions, that of the ambassador to the United States and also of the UN. He was on the governing body of the International Criminal Court, and then he took on what is arguably one of the toughest jobs in the world today, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Prince Zeid was a man born into royalty, who did everything he could and will continue to do to try to change the world. We're very grateful to have both of them here with us tonight. I have to say, because I met both of them repeatedly in my work, and I can tell you all tonight, they have been through some of the toughest of times and have dealt with some of the toughest of issues. I'll just tell you one anecdote. There I was once upon a time. In fact, it was 2 years ago, September 2016, outside the gleaming buildings of the United Nations headquarters in New York, and a ceasefire in the city of Aleppo. My dear colleague from Syria knows well what happened with the problems in the city of Homs. This was Aleppo, and it had broken down. 7 a.m. in the morning, Stephen O'Brien is walking past me, I'm right in front of the main door. Mr. O'Brien, what about that ceasefire breaking down? It is terrible, I'm so angry. Day 2, it got even worse in Aleppo. Stephen O'Brien, 7 a.m. Mr. O'Brien, what are you going to say to the BBC? I'm furious about what's happening. Day 3, I'm from the United Nations. It's getting even worse in Aleppo. Mr. O'Brien, what are you going to say? I am what is the word? Apoplectic.
You're running up.
Day 4, I'm from the United Nations building. Mr. O'Brien didn't have anything to say. These are frustrating times for any person who's trying to fight for. Let us begin by thanking them for the work. Let me speak with you. Let me begin with you. You have been through, in public and no doubt even worse in private, trying to take on the dictators, the authoritarian rulers, the abusers of human rights. What was the mood in which you ended your job? Did you end up thinking, you are now saying it's a defining moment for human rights, but there must have been moments when you wanted to give up?
Well, first of all, can I join you in saying how happy I am to be here? And in the course of the 4 years that I served as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I was called and referred to in many ways. I was called many things. I was called unhinged. I was called extreme, an agent of ISIS, a spokesperson for every terrorist group, because we were holding non-state actors and governments to account publicly alike. But I've never been called a lawyer, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a historian by training. I think you've characterized the situation correctly. It's a brawl out there. And notwithstanding the general background, the conditions that we see, the austerity measures that came about as a result of a banking sector that went basically awry and plunged the global economy into a financial hole in 2008. And notwithstanding the terrible crisis that we saw develop in Syria out of the torture of 15 children in Zeid. What we've seen happen in recent times is a group of third-rate politicians who otherwise would not get anywhere dip into a toolbox that was largely put to one side after the end of the Second World War, because it was well recognized that if you were to use what tools are available to you in the same way as Karl Lueger did, the infamous mayor of Vienna in 1890, and he took anti-Semitism and he turned it into an even more sort of virulent form, that it does yield political dividend for you in the short term. But in the end, it's ruinous to not just your own community, but to everyone. And these people were utterly shameless in dipping back into this toolbox. Not that it hadn't happened beforehand, but not in this way. And are essentially wrecking what we created over 70 years, not that it was perfect. And are putting us at enormous risk. I mean, Bolsonaro, over a year and a half ago, was such a fringe figure in Brazil. I mean, almost laughable character on the edge, a hate-filled character, a dangerous character. And then he rides in on 55% of the vote because the Brazilian economy was in such dire straits. But the judge also that was helping him, I mean, we have huge question marks about his conduct. And so we are at a real crossroads now. And it's not the time to think, well, maybe we shouldn't put enough pressure. The simple fact of the matter is we haven't put the sorts of pressure that we need to put on these characters. And we haven't even tested the proposition of whether it does yield the result. We assume that if we put some pressure on Viktor Orban, that he can do some jiu-jitsu and you come out the worst of it. But we don't really know that because we're not really doing it. The Council of Europe, of course, has been sort of thinking about this in great detail and of course Brussels has taken some steps. But we could do much, much more. Finally, on this initiative, it couldn't come sooner. I think both Stephen and I, as long-time practitioners, we sort of understood that there was this wealth of research and information that was out there, but seldom would it really come to us as people who had to make decisions and take decisions. And it was only on an incidental basis that we would ever hear that this group was in a particular country and they could help us understand better the background to what was happening. And we both think that, and together with Professor Mark Weller and Adam Coutts and others, that Cambridge could move into this space and help us. And we may be out of office today, hopefully we'll be back in at some stage, maybe not, I'm not sure, but you will be, but I won't. But we know enough people who can benefit greatly from the resources and the knowledge that is very much part of this, and it's one of the world's leading universities.
And Zeid, do you see this present juncture that we find ourselves in, you've just called it a crossroads, do you see this as a phase, a wave if you like, where you mentioned some leaders, and it's a question of institutions as well, may not be pulling their weight in the right direction? Is this something that we often use the phrase men and women of goodwill and resources can put things back together again, that will happen, or do you fear that this is the beginning of something new?
Well, it's both. I mean, one is that we have a group of leaders that, again, are relatively third-rate and are making themselves look clever because they're resorting.
But they're elected. You could say third-rate, but they're elected.
Of course they're elected.
Yes.
I mean, there's
and
famous,
elected in a way.
Of course.
You mentioned Bolsonaro, that he suddenly.
Of course, of course, and one doesn't. I mean, belittle that. Of course, you can't. But if you remember the discussion between Hermann Goering and the psychiatrist or psychologist at Nuremberg, Gustav Gilbert, and you look at that discussion, Goering discerned very, in a very simplistic form how it is you move populations. And he said it's easily done whether you're a democratic society or not. And precisely what he said at that time is now being used. I mean, this caravan working its way through Mexico. Does anyone really believe that it's incidental, and that they're going to turn up on the border, of the United States one day before the midterm elections. I mean, who would be so naive to believe it?
What do you think? What the
No,
Trump
I mean, I
supporters
think
are-
it needs to be looked at, because you look at who the president of Guatemala is. What is his belief system? What is his connection to Donald Trump? Right? Look at Honduras. This movement of people could have happened at any stage in the last 2 years. Why is it happening now? Right? And this is not new. I mean, these are old tactics. But they were, again, so discredited at one stage. And if you were going to lead, you would lead. It's hard to be a good head of state or government. It's hard to be a good politician. But you can be, some fringe character, and suddenly you have all the answers, and you're working on half-truths, and you're hurling abuse at a particular target population that you blame for everything. I mean, there's no genius in that. The problem is we have a whole group of political leaders that are silent, that don't say anything. And they leave it up to parts of the UN. Of course, civil society does, the media does. And I think with Khashoggi reached a point also where
Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist.
where there was it's an emblematic tipping point that we knew the crossing, as Robert Kagan said recently. Welcome to the jungle, and we're at the sort of the outer perimeter.
Mr. Chair, I haven't had time to read the article, but I saw a headline of an article when I was coming here in the New York Times saying, are the kind of idealistic speeches, the kind of the inspirational speeches that President Obama once made, do these have any power anymore? To speak in that idealistic way, do you have to respond in that kind of hate-tinged rhetoric that is being used by the Bolsonaros and the President Trump of this world? It's a war to fight back against this, and Sir Stephen looks like he's about to go to war. He's got all his charters here. He's got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's got the UN Charter. He's got the blue of the UN. He's got his hat. He wanted to put up a tent, but we told him, please, not in the building. There's health and safety reasons here. But you're about to fight back on this. Tell us is this what you're telling us tonight with this display?
It's maybe because the world has armed itself with some tools to make sure that we really did learn the lessons of this global series of conflicts that bedeviled the previous and the last century. And people of great goodwill and phenomenal cerebral care put together, and for no accident, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the de minimis that each and every human being has a right to expect belongs to them, and the Charter of the United Nations. And it just so happens that Adam Coots knows the story of this little booklet, which is why it was used as the background for what he then corrupted with his Photoshop, something I can never do, to be able to think. But I bought this as a Cambridge law undergraduate. You can tell how old I am because this cost me all of 32 pence. And this I bought at Heppers, and it's the UN Charter and the Statute of the International Court of Justice, because as a law student, with no idea I'd end up in the UN, I was so impressed by the care of the drafting, the concepts, and the lessons learnt that really did flow through this. And it's an amazing document that has stood the test of time for 73 years with no substantive amendments. And it's that which we've armed ourselves for, the diplomacy between member states, because it was addressing the grave concern of conflict as between member states. Our problem today, whether we've had the success relative of the MDGs, we have the hope in the SDGs, so I can keep myself here with number 16 in front of me, whether as a United Nations operative we go around with a laissez-passer, so I have to bring all the props in. But above all, the expectations of you arrive in a country when someone's life is at risk, they need protection, they're a vulnerable person, and the light blue is a beacon of hope. They expect us to come with an answer to help save their lives. And as humanitarians, we only have one constituency, and that's every human being on the planet. We are all global citizens, and we should all want for every global citizen exactly that which we would wish for ourselves. What has changed fundamentally is humanitarianism and the action that flows from it. It was never a pillar of the United Nations. That was peace and security through the Security Council. The victors of the Second World War basically garnered that power for themselves in exchange for development, the second pillar, where massive transfer of resources would take place from rich to developing countries in order for them to build an economic and political position. And third was human rights. And humanitarian action only came along basically by resolution in 1991, so it's about 27 years old, because people expect when there's a natural disaster emergency that we, the world, you vicariously would expect that big money through taxpayers and donors to be able to come to the rescue of people in need. That was fine, and we don't do that badly. It's always never fast enough, but we don't do it badly, and you have access. By and large, you can get to the people if you can physically get to them, because countries invite you in to help them recover, whether it's a tsunami in Indonesia recently or the Ecuadorian earthquake in April 16, wherever. The problem is, today, 86% of the 143 million people who need our help tonight is from man-made conflict. So my argument is very simple. It's man-made, and please, of course I mean man-woman-made, but sadly conflict, it is mainly man. But man-made can be unmade by man, but it requires good people, great will and courage to find that way forward. And that is the opportunity we have, given what I have been dealing with, which is humanitarian action around the world with amazing people, with amazing skill, with a UN that needs to garner $23 billion a year, all voluntary, none of it's by fee, it all has to be raised every year, but reacting post-event rather than investing to try and prevent and resolve conflict. But conflict is the main driver of human needs. So that's been my motivation to, first of all, thank all of you for coming and showing interest in this key subject of our times, in a chaotic world which has moved from bipolar to monopolar to no polar to nobody quite knows where they sit today, with a disrespect not just for human rights, but actually beyond member states. International humanitarian law, custodianed in Geneva, those Geneva Conventions which apply to each and every one of us, every citizen in the world, but where impunity, a lack of accountability, or transparency, a lack of evidence gathering, or tribunals that can make a determination to both punish and deter, it simply is not happening. And that it means that we're all complicit in a world which is finding it's losing its anchors, and we may possibly be losing our chance to learn the lessons from the Second World War, and a generation which doesn't feel it in its bones that these structures, inadequate as they are, with nobody having proposed anything better, are not going to serve us well. So we had the World Humanitarian Summit, which I won't go into the detail, help do a lot of the thinking that gives us a clue on what we need to do to make for a world where every human being can have an equal chance of not just surviving, but one day thriving.
Because we're in a university setting, because we're in a place with lots of big minds who want big answers, let me set a challenge to both of you and see, to try to draw out of you what have been some of your lessons learned and some positive lessons learned. So, Prince Zeid, if I can start with you. It would, crudely drawn, it would seem to me that we are living in a time where human rights human rights advocacy has, in too many cases, become a box-ticking exercise. Something terrible happens in Yemen, then every NGO, every human rights agency uses all of the megaphones it has now. They get onto Twitter, they get onto Facebook, they send emails to journalists like me. They complain about it, they express their outrage. Everyone expresses outrage. The next day, something terrible happens in Myanmar. So the same instruments, the best platforms we've ever had that everyone can use, again everyone expresses outrage, everyone expresses outrage. Day 3, it's again. So that the anger about human rights, the advocacy of human rights simply becomes part of the system. Give me examples where you felt it wasn't just an endless treadmill of expressing anger about something, not getting a response, expressing anger about something else.
Well, I mean, it's quite easy to respond to this. Yes, the civil society organizations funded from different sources are very vocal like that, and likewise our office was. But our office was able to also create investigations, international investigations. One in Yemen, which the Arab group fought tooth and nail for 2 years, and then finally we managed, I asked for it right from the very beginning, and finally we managed to get it. One most recently on Venezuela, which also took some time. We had been asking for it for going back, I think, to 2000.
Before you get to Venezuela, tell us a little bit more about Yemen. Yemen, as you may know, is the world's worst humanitarian crisis now. It's also a devastating war being fueled by many world powers. What is it exactly you were able to do that made a difference to ease the suffering or to try to end the bloodshed?
Well, I mean, I had 18 investigators in Yemen, and the information started to come to us fairly quickly. And I remember a discussion I had with them. I was extremely impressed, one, by their courage where they were. And this is constantly, and I had 2 people in tanks. And we weren't turning a blind eye to what the Houthis and Saleh were doing. We were watching all of that very carefully and commenting on it. But it was clear to us that something was terribly, terribly wrong with what was happening. And so we asked for an international investigation as the first means of then eventually bringing criminal accountability to the fore. And we were rebuffed the first year, and even the second. The third year, though, we insisted on it, and we got it. And the group of eminent experts, including one ex-Cambridge lawyer, military prosecutor, they submitted their report in August. And what did the report say? The report said that the SOPs and the machinery that the coalition had put in place was really of a high standard, excellent. But they couldn't correlate all of that with what they were seeing on the ground. There was a huge gulf between what was happening in the capitals with what they were seeing on the ground. And it sort of lends one to think, as we see in many countries, that if you sort of view human rights abuses simply as a future public relations challenge that you must overcome, and you're not getting to the heart of the problem, it's a disservice not just to the people who are suffering grievously, but to your own reputation. And also, just to sort of little dig at the media. What was not appreciated,
that wasn't on the agenda, but anyway.
What was not appreciated was that there was a list, that these investigators submitted the list. What does that mean? It means we went from a human rights investigation to the beginnings of a criminal investigation. In other words, it's not whether a particular party involved in the coalition is potentially culpable for the crimes committed, and this has to be decided by a court, of course, in due course. But that individuals within those states are now having their names on lists, and they go quite high. In other words, it's as we were saying, human rights are dealing with the legitimacy of government. It's an extremely powerful instrument, but it needs the support of the international community to make it effective. And so it's not just crying shouting in the wind. It's actually eventually creating the building blocks. And some states may exercise universal jurisdiction. There are groups of lawyers and journalists everywhere amassing evidence. And who's to say that in a few years, someone who thought they would be, somehow enjoying a form of impunity wouldn't be hauled up before a court? And maybe one of the students here would be a judge at that stage. And we would want it to be sooner, but I wouldn't discount it from happening eventually.
So this is the building blocks then, that you think that these very painstaking, most forensic investigations are putting in place a kind of a foundation that's, the belief that ultimately the arc of history tends toward justice, that one day there will be justice.
Yes. But if we, and I think the criticism is apt of the international media, in the sense that the sustained attention given to the Khashoggi case over a course of now 3 weeks, and against all the froth that comes on a daily basis through our news media, but if that can only be replicated in some of the most serious and violent conflicts, perhaps we would see a change in terms of a political outcome. And so, if the media can do it in respect of one of their own, why can't they extend the same courtesy to those terrible events happening in Yemen, and many people are suffering, and you've seen it.
Yes. I mean, on that particular point, and for those of you who don't follow Yemen closely, it's basically you have the Houthis who stormed into the capital 2014, 2015, and the Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates launched efforts to restore what's regarded as a legitimate government of Yemen. So you have an Arab coalition with the leading powers, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, backed and supported militarily by the UK, the US, France, other Western powers, fighting against the Houthis who are aligned with Iran. And that's how it goes. I'm not going to defend the media because the media has done more than its share of, well, not doing enough. But because the Saudis don't allow journalists to go on planes to get into Sana'a, which has been one of the only safe ways to get in, it effectively means that journalists haven't been able to go to the north of Yemen, which is where most Yemenis live and where the greatest suffering and the greatest casualties are. But it's an interesting example. The New York Times, Declan Walsh and Tyler Hicks and my colleague Orla Gearin, they finally got in, and the emaciated child was on the front page of the New York Times. And is it a coincidence that Mattis and Pompeo in the United States, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, have now called for a ceasefire within 30 days? I'd like to hope that helped the drumbeat. But you're absolutely right that, and I think it underlines tonight, human rights is not just, it takes people taking on tough jobs, but it's also a job for the media, it's a job for academics, it's a job for people in religious positions of authority within the world's great religions, but it's also for you, all of us as citizens. Stephen O'Brien, since you've left the UN is getting sidelined in all the great conflicts and there's a UN envoy on every major conflict of our time. And yet we've seen in Syria, they were pushed aside, Stefan de Mistura. It was the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians who were making the decisions. In Yemen, Martin Griffiths is having to face off against the Saudis and the Emiratis who are pushing for military solutions on the ground. Time and again, we're seeing that the United Nations isn't the most powerful player on the block. I mean, is that both a source of frustration but also a great source of weakness?
Well, you're right on both counts, because of course the UN is an absolute vast structure, edifice, and has so many aspects to it. At the political and the diplomatic, whilst it is unquestionably the highest diplomatic body in the world, and those of us who were at the senior positions and rather flatteringly called the World Cabinet, but we would sit and discuss issues, but we couldn't resolve anything, because in the end it's governed by the General Assembly of Member States and by the particular committees like the Security Council. With the power of veto means that when you have proxies such as Russia in Syria, it meant that in effect they could block the combined will of the world expression, but with all the vested interests and the vying for advantage, has made it not just absent power, but its influence has declined. Now
because some envoys I know fear that they are becoming a fig leaf.
Well,
that the military powers can say, oh yes, there's a UN peace process. We're talking to the UN envoy, and then you can say we're trying, but in fact the war continues.
Well, you're right. There isn't anything better at the moment, and therefore, and particularly because the thing is structured to be a regulator and resolution between member states, where you get these internally arising conflicts, which is the vast majority protracted, deliberately and demographically trying to suppress the often the most vulnerable, certainly the most marginalised. We haven't got the means and structures by which we can try and address either early intervention or even post facto very serious internal strife, which then gets hijacked by proxies. You can see that whether it's in Yemen, very seriously, or Syria, or Ukraine, or wherever it may be. Very, very difficult issues. So of course the UN struggles to be relevant, and yes, you can call in the UN as an effort to try and legitimise, in the same way as, I won't say who said it, but there was a point early on in the Yemen dispute where, as you know, I called it in 2016 as the world's worst humanitarian disaster. That's when we were facing 7 million who we thought might be facing a famine which could be averted. It's now looking more like 14 million are heading in that direction. But the the big challenge was that there is a resolution at the UN which says that the current Hadi government of Yemen is the legitimate government, i.e. represents through an election the member states' legitimate government. Therefore, it is right for the international community, member state to member state, to try and, as it were, oust rebels who are trying to basically solve a long-standing dispute between what is still an unreconciled North and South Yemen in broadest terms. And after some very, very poor governance and bad leadership and very often violent conflict, and humanitarian needs flow from abuses of human rights or bad governance, although very often they can take place when there's still non-violent conflict. So it is quite clear that the United Nations is struggling in the absence of having relevance for internally arising conflicts where it is legitimate for someone to say, do not come and interfere in my state. I am a legitimate sovereign nation behind a Westphalian boundary where I'm entitled to take my own decisions. And that's what even President Assad in Syria relied on for a long time. So this is a real concern. It's why this initiative, it's why today's meetings, why the various discussions we're having, and why Professor Weller's initiative and Cambridge's ownership of this issue, I think, is so important, because we as practitioners have really struggled to have access to what can you do, what tools work to try and find influential points which complement the UN, which is very much dependent on the member state issue, whereas most of what we're tackling, either the consequences or the abuses, are from within states. And we need a better way of using the evidence, the cerebral brilliance here, of all its various atomized parts to come together to help us as practitioners find that right conversation at the right moment, so that you wouldn't be asking that question in a year's time.
So you need stronger institutions, you need leaders committed to human rights values, and you need a toolbox. Every mediator I know talks about their toolbox. Before I open it up to your questions, the question has always been asked about everyone who's held your job, Zeid, is it better to speak out about human rights in public,
Yes.
to name and to shame, or is it, as some leaders have chosen, better to talk in quiet, behind the scenes? What is your verdict now that you've done it?
Yeah, it's rubbish. It really is. Talking in quiet is so ridiculous. No
That
one
has been the British preferred.
Yeah, no one's serious. No one's serious who's been involved in this believes this. First of all, there's no naming and shaming. The shame is brought upon themselves. They're the ones who are denying their peoples the basic rights to not live in a system which discriminates against them, to not live in a system that deprives them of the basic social and legal protections, to not live in a system where their life is guided by fear. Shame on them. Shame on them. You know, and it is important to speak out. It is hugely important to speak out. We have a whole generation of politicians that's so desperately frightened to say anything. They leave office and then they become brave and then they become courageous and say the right thing. And contrast that with all the amazing people at the community level, social workers, people who are willing to risk everything. They go to jail, they're being tortured, they've been detained for 20 years, journalists, lawyers, for saying the right thing. And then you have all these cowardly politicians who refuse to sort of say, because they might lose some funding or they might lose an election coming up. The stakes are so high now. We can lose everything. We've achieved a great deal, and we can lose everything.
So you felt it accomplished more? Because I know sometimes when you really spoke out, including against President Trump, you pushed back against some of his more outrageous statements, and then you got attacked again so it became a kind of a war of words.
Let me explain to you just very quickly. The huge pressure that we face, that Stephen and I face, didn't come from government. Honestly, the abuse from governments, we get used to it very quickly. And I couldn't care less who it came from, right? Even my own country. Right? The hardest pressure to deal with is when you're constantly meeting the victims of the worst abuses and you somehow feel you're incapable. You try everything, but you're incapable of bringing relief to them. And that inadequacy is what hurts the most, I think. And that's what compels us to go out and to denounce these governments who don't care about their people. They care about certain sections of their people. They don't care about Look, Lyse, I went to about 43 countries. And in the vast majority of countries, I was unimpressed by the Prime Minister, the President, the Head of State I was meeting. But not because somehow they were bad people, but they just didn't care. We were discussing domestic issues, issues relating to their own people, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and they didn't care. I mean, so why? Look, the other thing is that
Because you said about the human rights defenders you met, I mean, one of your parting statements was that they're the ones who
They're the ones.
That's the strength of human rights.
They're ones. I have 3 children. I would want them to have the qualities these young human rights defenders have. I mean, I'll give you an example. There was a young 20-year-old, one of the student leaders in Nicaragua, who came from Managua. They managed to get out and came to see me. And he was the age of many of the students here. You know, utterly fearless, right? And I said to him, are you going to go back? And he said, yes. I said, you know what's going to happen. And he did go back, and he was arrested. And I don't know whether he's in or out, but I can only assume the worst things have happened to him. And how many of us normally, would decide to risk everything and go out and do this? And that's the selflessness, that's the integrity that I would like to see in my children. Not some of these politicians who speak big and are utterly useless in many respects, self-serving, corrupt, and so forth. And finally, look, most of the work we did was quiet diplomacy. But to be credible and to yield the result, they have to believe that you can go public. If they think that you don't have the courage to go public, no matter what you say in private, you're not going to produce a result. But if they know that when I say, Mr. President, if you don't do this, I'm going to go at a press conference tomorrow, and I'm going to say this. I mean, and they will know that you are entirely capable of doing it.
And it's structured that way.
And
because the Security Council has the private session after the public session.
Yeah.
Very often, in order to reserve the difficult stuff for the private session. Unfortunately, I wasn't very well schooled, and therefore I didn't behave accordingly. It's no coincidence, actually, as it happens, that Zeid and I, neither of us were appointed for second terms.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
But I do believe very passionately that if you are given a voice for people who need that voice and they haven't got it for themselves, then if you don't use it, you're not worthy of the job. And you are given a chance, and it's a very great privilege as well as obviously a big responsibility. But I also will speak, given that I've also been through the process of getting elected as a politician and sitting in the parliament.
Sorry, I'm attacking politicians.
No, no, it's, I'm well used to it. But let's be clear, what is currently the problem, irrespective of anything that's happened in the past, because of the rise of populism, where you're absolutely right to haul us up, that if you are an elected person, you come with the authority of being elected. It matters to me enormously that when I was sitting in Parliament, it's a privilege to have a seat, of course, and have a platform, but at the end of the day, it's the people who I was living amongst in the constituency who put me there, and I needed to speak up. If I didn't, quite rightly, they would want to remove me at the next opportunity. And so I think it's absolutely vital we use the voice, but clearly when you do so, your power in the end, whether you're in the Secretariat, in the UN or elsewhere, or in opposition, even in this country, your power is very limited. In government, you have real power, real money, real decision making, but you're very busy and you're very accountable. The time to exercise power of embarrassment, of reputational risk, is when you're in opposition or when you're sitting around the Security Council table, as I did on East Aleppo, as we had rather a big problem there, where I was extremely frank in my assessment. And as it happens, Russia was president of the council at that point, and the then PR laid into me rather fast, and it was the only time that the US and others came to my rescue whilst we were sitting around the Wall Street. But that, I think, gave a lot of hope, mainly to people trying to help people in East Aleppo, not because we were going to change the course of the war, but because it meant that people there felt, thank goodness, somebody somewhere is looking out for us and trying to make things better. And you were doing that repeatedly, and that was my moment. And I think
leadership definitely matters. Let's just get a sense of what people in this room are feeling. How many of you, just like have a show of hands, how many of you come here tonight feeling really worried? Not just about the way the state of the world is in, but where it's going. How many of you are really worried? Wow. How many of you are on more balance saying, Oh, we'll get there. We'll be able to get through this. Oh. You can vote for twice of them, or you can vote for both of them. Good. Mark has to be, it's his initiative. Well, let's have some questions from you. It's good to hear what's on your mind, and if you don't mind sharing with us, tell us who you are and maybe what you're doing and why you're here. Okay. There's a microphone. Adam is, how the mighty have fallen. Adam's now the microphone man. Thanks.
Thanks. So my main worry goes back.
So what's your name and what?
Joseph Kelman, studying law.
Okay, there you go.
So,
yes.
sorry.
Sorry, Zaid, I thought you studied law. Only God is perfect. I was allowed one mistake. Yeah.
This is particularly present on law. You mentioned before the issue you have with politicians these days. But the other thing that you mentioned quite significantly was the importance of asserting human rights against those politicians. And the real fear I had with what you're saying, although of course I'm very pro human rights, is that do you think the assertion of human rights in an age where most of the major economies and democracies are now led by far-right governments will undermine democratic legitimacy and effectively undermine your own aims?
It's an excellent question, and of course we're very careful to note in all the stuff that we've said in public that we recognize their elected democratically. But we also feel, recognizing that these patterns we've seen in the past, that again they've gone into a toolbox long rejected, or at least it was rejected by a generation or two of politicians who recognize that when you take a half-truth and you begin to spin it, and you clearly have an economic background condition which is not good, and people are feeling pain, and you have terrorism, and you have these sort of noxious ideologies out there, that you can produce a great result. And you have, it all boils down to fear. Manipulation of fear on one hand, and then the fear of others to actually get involved and say, you know, stop this. Right? And then when you have, of course, a democratically elected leader that shows no shame, because they assume, well, they can be elected out of office, but at the same time, we know that the election was a fraud, or that the judiciary is being compromised, such that the sort of veneer of a democracy is being maintained, but it's so hollow. And I think, you know, in Venezuela, you could see this a few years ago, it was headed in that direction. So I think we need to be sober as well. And look, I'm not going to be duped by these people. Right? And others can be, but I'm not willing to be duped. I lived through the part of the period in the former Yugoslavia. I can see where all of this, you know, where all of this takes us. And the cruelties, the lies, the manipulations, the cowardly reactions by the international community. And, you know, for us, and it's the point you raised, Lyse, when speaking about Yemen, when in the summer of 1995, after the Srebrenica disaster, the international community changed their approach, and a rapid reaction force was sent to Sarajevo. And within about 2 months, the fighting ended. And then the obvious question arose, well, why didn't this happen in 1992? Why did it have to happen in 1995? So, I mean, we need leadership. I mean, we're so desperate for it. Desperate. We need the help of academia. And we need, you know, for academic institutions, leading academic institutions, dare I say it, to be activists. Not just producing first-class research and publications and hoping that somehow it would get to policymakers or policy, because it doesn't often, unless we're involved and we're talking to our friends. And that's what we need. And because there is, look, I mean, I can give you a rosy story of what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in Malaysia, there are good trends happening there. But I don't want to sort of cloud or create some fog here, because the larger forces at work are deeply worrisome or worrying, and it requires a call to action. Most of the populations around the world are still half asleep. 7.6 billion people, I think, are on this planet. If we're all worried, why don't we see 100 million people out on the street saying this is not good enough? You're putting us all at risk.
Yep.
And it's still a small number. But there are too many people who are not engaged in the way that we'd like to see. Sorry for being
No, it has to be an issue for everybody. 1 second, yes, and then you.
The UN.
And introduce yourself.
Sorry. I'm Victoria Stewart Jolly, Law and Politics. The UN has had very dark times in the past, and I'm thinking the 80s. Kurt Waldheim as the Secretary General was not a high point. However, right now it's particularly dark. How do you see the old lady weathering this term? And in the next 10 years, what do you think is the future for the organisation?
I can answer it very quickly, at least from my perspective. For me, and I was in the Security Council, I chaired I don't know how many different committees and working groups, and for me that's not the UN. The UN is going to Libya, and with colleagues of mine who go in every day into the worst areas, risking their lives, and being shot at, and one group was kidnapped, and then they were shot with an RPG, narrowly escaped, and within a week they were back with me in Libya. And it irritates me to no end when you see people like that, who are the salt of the earth, amazing people, and others criticize the UN. And criticism of the meetings of the Security Council are well merited. But that's for us, not the UN. I mean, Stephen had some of the bravest people you can ever imagine working for him. And so when criticism is merited, we'll accept it. And you've said it, there have been the cholera in Haiti, all the sex abuse and exploitation by UN peacekeepers, horrific development. But there is also great heroism and enormous work being done on behalf of people who would otherwise perish very easily.
But sadly, because everyone in the UN says the UN is its member countries, and because one of its biggest funders, the United States, is threatening and has pulled out some money, and has made it clear they don't want any criticism of the United States. We've seen it. Antonio Guterres came in promising a surge in diplomacy, and he has great admiration, but many are saying, let's bring Ban Ki-moon back.
Well, people were wanting a general rather than a secretary to succeed Ban Ki-moon. What's happened, of course, in the UN, and I think we need to be really careful not to get sidetracked by either particular personalities or indeed the edifice of the UN. I think you have to look at the facts at the moment. There's been a lot of rhetoric by the Trump administration about the UN, but actually the money hasn't gone down too far. And looking at it with the cold eye of experience, and also given that I was not I've been in the private sector, I've had to understand about efficiency and making sure that money really serves the purpose it was given. The UN is a very bloated, fat, big, inefficient bureaucracy with a lot of vested interests vying for advantage. So yes, it could do with a big amount of reform, and it could do with doing a lot less, and what it does, it could do with doing a lot better. So it is really overdue that, but the incentive for that to happen is very difficult when you've got to get the agreement of 193 states, and why it, for instance, is missing on the, dare I put it like this, the battlefield of internally displaced persons, because that's the interference in state, but actually forced displacement and the care and protection that those people need is even greater, can you believe it, than refugees, where laws and having crossed a border gives you all sorts of access to protection and status, which you don't get by being one of the 6.5 million in Syria at the moment who are internally displaced. So the UN is rightly to be challenged, but I think we need to be really careful. At the end of the day, it is, from experience, it is the shield as well, because that charter and the aspirations which it starts, quite rightly, we the peoples, it's not we the UN as institutions, we the peoples wish to make for a better, more peaceful world as a result of the guarantees which we seek to do that. The fact it is operated not very well, and the Security Council at the moment is dysfunctional, shouldn't deter us from always wanting to draw upon the very best of what it can offer. As you rightly said, I had at my disposal some of the most phenomenally skilled, brave, selfless people anybody could ever hope to have at their command to deploy to meet emergencies. I myself went to Syria on a number of occasions until eventually I was made persona non grata, I wonder why. And of course horrific things happened where, because you represent the UN, therefore the aspiration of a world to say to this particular country, this is unacceptable and we want it to stop, but the mechanisms are not really working. But of course I had to sit down with the Deputy Foreign Minister, who's still in his post, Mr. Baghdad, as I was in the meeting with him and talking as close, trying to negotiate access to the Syrian Arab Red Crescent to come and relieve. A fighter jet went, what I thought was coming through the room. I ducked. He seemed to be completely relaxed about it. But anyway, came straight through. And later we heard that about 48 people had been killed in the Douma market. Now, whether that was staged for my benefit, gosh, I hardly dare talk about it. But it's that kind of appallingness you're dealing with. If I hadn't been there because the UN is there, then that would have just completely gone unnoticed. At least I was able to bring that back as testimony. I'm telling you about it now. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. Therefore, you have to find mechanisms to be determined to address it.
Right.
These two gentlemen have...
Yes. Salah al-Bandar, European Center for Study of Extremism. Allow me first, as a Sudanese, to thank these both gentlemen, His Honorable Sir O'Brien and His Highness Prince Rad, for saving lives and protecting communities. Really, as Sudanese, I appreciate what you did on the ground, and as a person who worked in the front line for years, I can see the testimony to what you have been doing. Thank you very much for what you have been doing. My question, in 2005, the United Nations really managed to bring the whole concept of right to protect. And the right to protect is such an instrument which will help us as communities to feel that if our own governments cannot really protect their own people, the international community will do it. But we had two more critical elements of this. First of all, the rising role of the non-state actors in conflicts made it extremely difficult for the international community to take any initiative. And I would really hope the new initiative here in Cambridge would look at that, rather than really being bogged on issues of how the structures of states and the United Nations structure since 1945 is doing it. What we can do to initiate new flexible mechanisms to deal with the non-state actors and their atrocities. Daesh is an example. The second question, which I'm really horrified as a Sudanese as well, and I witness it, as a person who's in the front line of protecting communities, the way that some of the senior members of the Security Council used the veto really stopped the whole concept of protecting communities. How are we going to deal with that? If the United Nations decided to do that as a Security Council to do it, and take very serious decisions about it, how we can really make a flexible, more protective and proactive decisions. And I think this initiative will really benefit a lot if they can address that gaps. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. That's actually, you pointed to two of the really major weaknesses or major problems in the system today, at the bottom with the non-state actors and at the top with the Security Council. And so I think not just in Sudan, but other places. And your question too, sir.
My name is Vikram Khool, and my colleagues and I are soon launching the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies.
Okay.
You've mentioned conflicts that are hardly 7 years old, and definitely it's a very important issue. However, let's just go back about and talk about or ask about the role of UN or the UN relating to a 70 years old conflict, Palestine. Could you please tell us what is it takes for Palestine when it comes to international human rights law? Also, you mentioned the vetoes of Russia and China about the 7-year-old conflict. Could you tell us a little bit about the position of America towards Palestine in the last 70 years, and if not, just to mention the withdrawal of funds and their wish to completely abolish UNRWA and possibly with the so-called deal of the century, eradicate the Palestinian cause. Thank you.
Yeah.
Which one do you want to take?
Shall I do?
I mean, you've dealt with
first?
yes. You've
Okay.
dealt with
Okay.
yeah.
Pieces.
All right. Look, I think it's for me. I was always surprised that the UN didn't help itself by insisting that there be a notation after the two letters UN, a small m or an s, so that we can basically distinguish between what are the responsibilities of the member states. For many years, I was ambassador at the UN. And then what are the responsibilities of the Secretariat, which is what, of course, Stephen and I both led different parts of it for a number of years. Because if we don't clarify that, it's just an awful mess and you don't know what people are talking about, essentially. So, first of all, when it comes to the issue of Palestine, of course, it's a source of huge frustration from everyone in the UN, because there's enough of a UN presence, and it's been there for so long, that it's not like the UN doesn't know from the Secretariat point of view what's happening. The UN knows fully well what's happening. But to go back to the issue of the veto, the situation in the Security Council is so completely blocked. I mean, there was one occasion, and I was still Jordan's ambassador to the UN at the time, and where the Bush administration was churning out veto after veto, I think 10 in all, when we went through the second intifada. So the ambassador of Palestine, Nasser al-Qudwa, he wrote up a short resolution. He came to the Arab group adopted it, and it was vetoed by the US. And what did it say, that resolution? Well, what he did is he went to the last few speeches of President Bush, and he took President Bush's language and he put it into the resolution. So the US vetoed the president's own language, and there was no addition made to it. And he wanted just to demonstrate how absurd the whole thing is, essentially. In terms of what the Secretary of Human Rights, I mean, we generate an enormous number of reports, and we try to, and we should do more on this, the three dimensions. The issue of the human rights within Israel proper, the issue of human rights in the Palestinian context, irrespective of the occupation, and then the issue of the gross violation of human rights when it comes to the occupation itself. And like this, you approach it in a way where you can point to all the deficits and all the improvements, if there are some. At the moment, I think the office I was leading is getting quite close to the release of the database, the information concerning the database, and it should come quite soon. But these mandates are given to the office, and the office works on them and resolve. But the overall situation is what we see. And ultimately, perhaps, and notwithstanding everything we've said, I've said that the UN is as great or as pathetic as the international community is out there. And you can't have a great UN when the situation out there is so pathetic, and you vice versa. And that's this unfortunate situation that we're in.
What's the balance between great and pathetic? 50-50,
Well,
70-30?
It comes to circles often.
Yeah, that we can produce a result.
Mhm.
And the issue of the veto is a very, very serious issue. And we can get into the details on this because there's a significant amount of legal thinking on this. But maybe I'll leave it to you.
Well, I'm not going to do the legal stuff because I think what we're trying to address here this evening, what this new initiative is trying to find new tools, new access to thinking and expertise which can be used in a practical way to find ways forward against these terrible obstacles. I've had, just as one does, I've had some extreme thoughts in my mind when I've shared them with wise people like Mark and others, and they get shot down in flames very quickly. But it would be very nice if we could use one of the redundant committees of the UN, the Trusteeship Council, meets for 5 minutes a year. It was the old Decolonization Council, which pretty well did a good job after the war for about 15 years and has fallen into disuse. But there was a whole idea of responsibility to protect, which through incredibly difficult challenges of member states eventually agreeing to that program, and very much your office and your department being responsible for so much of its advocacy and its implementation. And then it went into a very nasty down phase, and then up, and then down again. Strong feelings that there comes a point, whether it's democratic governments, with all the authority that being elected gives you. Take, for example, and I make no bones about it, discussions I've had with President Salva Kiir, an elected politician in South Sudan, but face to face, I've said to him, I really think you're doing terrible damage to your own people. Now, the next sentence I would like to say, as a result of which, we need to put you, if you like, as a country into special measures. We need to be able to arbitrate your ability to look after your own people, and then come out with a solution, and then, as it were, make sure that the self-determination and the responsibility.
Of
course not,
no.
Which is why it gets shot down in flames. But it's also partly because of the frustration of needing to find something that bypasses the Security Council, which is inadequate to the task, and is not fit for purpose at the moment, in terms of finding a way of addressing when countries fail their own people, normally deliberately, but even by accident. And I think it's those type of non-state actors, disrespect for borders, picking up on the point that was made there. As long as you can get in, there's an amazing amount of good work that can be done. I was able to go to more countries and say, because as a humanitarian, people didn't mind lives being saved. They didn't like the idea of protecting vulnerable people like women, girls, and minorities. It was more difficult for you because you were carrying with you the values of human rights, which was not necessarily to the support of ultimately the big test is always about power and money. And people are contesting for that the whole time, and people will take very legitimate ways to do it. So that's where, because even as I have trialled, and equally I've had no acclamation for my brilliant idea of arbitration tonight, it's clear that we need the continuing help. That's why I don't want to make too much of a plug of this. Why this initiative? It's not as though it's some kind of nice to have. I think from our experience, it's become absolutely vital that we find new ways of thinking that's going to support the practice of how do we get in early and how do we resolve what at the end of the day are simply man-made creations of violence and deprivation, which we can therefore address. We have to find a way, which is why this initiative is so important.
There's two up there.
My name is Alice Musabende, PhD in Politics and International Studies. My question is going to be for Sir O'Brien, just because you just mentioned South Sudan. Yesterday there was a big celebration in Juba because of the signature of an accord between the rebel faction and the government of Salva Kiir. I want to ask this question because I want to go back to an issue that I don't think that we often talk about when we talk about peacemaking, and this is a question of trust between ideas that come from the Western world, such as these that we are debating here, and locally grown solutions. Often these discussions paint governments, African governments mostly, but I think also elsewhere, as ruthless and hateful of their own people, as though they don't have much of interest in actually solving the problems. Yesterday, at the end of the conclusion of this meeting in Juba, the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, tweeted a very interesting comment in which he said that foreigners had wanted to make South Sudan as they did Libya, but it did not work. Clearly, there is an issue of trust, there is an issue of faith, and it's growing. It's part of a trend that we see in mostly African countries where they don't believe that ideas, mostly of human rights, but also of governance and intervention, actually work. Now, as we think about moving forward, what kind of solutions or perhaps even recommendations that you would see happening if we are working from a place of distrust? And if we are working from a place where these governments still retain a lot of power, it doesn't matter how much one does not like them, they still have a lot of power and they do decide on the fate of their people. So how do we bridge the gap between this question of distrust and the fact that we do indeed have to come up with solutions that solve these intractable conflicts? Thank you.
As Kofi Annan, if Kofi Annan was alive, he would talk about African solutions for African problems. The gentleman next to you, Toope, will get to it. Your moment, it better be good.
Patrick Brilton, I'm a historian.
Good.
So Stephen, you mentioned the tendency of several governments referring to Westphalian borders in order to defend against intervention and proxy wars. Well, one of the benefits of the Peace of Westphalia was that the powers involved.
That's the last thing you. Well, I guess we don't need a historian, actually. I'm teasing. Go.
Was that?
This exactly proves why you need the Cambridge Initiative. Please go. Yes.
Was that power sharing arrangements were determined for the region in question and then guaranteed internationally, whereby the guarantor powers were given the right to sort of in a legal framework uphold and guarantee these power sharing arrangements between religious groups, because it was viewed as a potential security risk, this conflict. To what extent do you think the UN might play a role in mediating a similar arrangement whereby some sort of a process of negotiation among the interested parties, both in conflict zones and internationally, determine improved power sharing arrangements, and then channel this tendency of destructive, violent intervention in existing conflicts into a legal framework of imposing, interventions for peace in order to uphold generally agreed power sharing arrangements?
That's interesting. Your questions dovetail a little bit, which is good. Yeah. Good.
I'm definitely going to ask Zeid to contribute. I'm not going to take all this on my shoulders, but first of all, thank you for the first question, because I think it was very, very important, and I appreciate the respectful way that you did it, because there is a grave danger that we all see the world through only our own eyes, and of course we're all creatures of our upbringing and our education, as well as our experience. And so I think it's natural to plead guilty that, in a sense, those who are seeking to find better ways forward will tend to want to replicate a version of what they think works. So yes, there is a sort of received Western model of values and rights and organizational, administrative and political arrangements which are intended to be accountable, which is where this idea of export of democracy. But I'm equally proud of the fact I happen to be born in Tanzania. I was brought up and educated in East Africa. That gave me a certain boyhood insight, at least into that context. And I'm equally conscious that part of what the Trusteeship Council did, which was the decolonization, of course, there was then bequeathed democratic institutions where that was the very last system that had been used when they had been under the subject to colonial power. So where was the practice and training for that to make sure that it was well understood as a method of legitimate sense of engagement, not just power transaction, engagement? And I think you're right to raise these very fundamental questions. But whilst I certainly go along with Kofi Annan, whose memory we all deeply respect, about African solutions for African problems, I think there comes a point where certain leaders, or the absence of leadership, have so forsaken trust, even if they have power, that there has to be a sense of a legitimate route by which that can at least be intervened and pointed out, and for pressure to be brought to bear so that the people who are suffering can be alleviated, and that violence, if it is violence, can be done. But equally, then you have to move across to the second question, which is about effectively borders. Are they a construct of the past, or are they something into the future? My own personal view, and maybe it's my Cambridge education as a lawyer that leads me down this track, but it's one of the few things in the world at the moment which is settled broadly. Borders. So if we start disturbing the idea that the Westphalian solution to what determines the nation status, the economic entity, the political accountable entity, the jurisprudential entity, then we just increase the amount of chaos and uncertainty into already a very chaotic world. So I would be in favour of holding borders as sacrosanct, so that it gives legitimacy to whoever designs government within that and the legal rule of law that applies. I would like to see over that, which is interesting in a country which is Brexiting, I would like to see over that something like international humanitarian law has a reach, a bit like international law, like the International Criminal Court, which Zeid was in charge of the member state representation, to reach over that. So you had some form of non-UN, i.e. therefore not having to be agreed by member states, but was of access to each and every individual. So it would then help you to build what has been one of the best examples of African solutions to African problems that I've experienced, is apart from the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, not a million miles apart from what's been taking place in Northern Ireland, albeit with very patchy results, but actually the local types of tribunal courts in Rwanda, which have been helpful in trying to take the sting, decades later, out of continuing cases of those who are accused of genocide. That is really important because Rwanda is, for no doubt, all its faults, is nonetheless a functioning society today. And I'll give you one final point. It's not least because it's one of the leading countries today to have engaged women in politics and ownership and the means of production. And that has enabled the natural wish to put family and communities first to dominate Rwandan life.
And not a country, but with all the achievements, so human rights is still an issue, burning issue in Rwanda, I guess. Okay.
No, so, Alice, we need to talk. I remember 30 years ago being where you are and loving to skewer, a diplomat visiting Cambridge and being sitting in the back row and just putting the knife in. And I greatly enjoyed it.
Spear, an African spear.
Look, I think this whole argument there's no argument to it. Who was it that was demanding civil and political rights when they were under colonialism? Right? It was the liberation movements, nascent, and then the very active liberation movements. It was the liberation movements of the African continent which were demanding those rights. And suddenly they claim now it's a Western contrivance. I mean, it's nonsense. The other point, apartheid South Africa complained bitterly whenever the Organization of African States would marshal support against it internationally with the ANC, that this was interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign country. And repeatedly, the UN General Assembly rejected this argument. No basis for it. There is, therefore, no argument to be had that comments about the obligations and the defaulting on the human rights obligations by a country, after all, they accede to a treaty's binding law, and they're not abiding by it, yes, they should have to answer to it. This idea that it's only the African countries that are beaten about. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, we've attacked everyone. We're equal opportunity attacker. But also with a sense of humility, because we also know the UN is not perfect. And the UN has, there have been appalling episodes of abuse on the part of the UN. And I say this to all of them, to all the heads of state and government that I used to meet. So the argument somehow that we have to get away from that. The other thing is that I don't go in there and immediately insult Kabila or Nkurunziza or whoever I'm seeing. No, we sit and we go through a long sort of discussion and things that we'd like to see happen. And then if after some period of time nothing is happening, it's going backwards, then I will go public. Just finally, I'll give you, we can learn. We can learn. And I learned something from the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia. I went to see him in February, I think, 2 weeks after he gave a magnificent speech in the National Assembly. And we were sitting at a big group of us. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I need you to do this, and I need you to do that, and I gave a long laundry list. And he pushed back, and he was tough. And he said, you're coming to me with all these Western views. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I don't represent the West, I represent the international community, and I represent international human rights law. And so it was quite frosty. And then the rest left, and it was just the two of us. And he broke into this giant grin. And he said, come here. He put the seat next to him. And he said to me, look, I can't be seen to just be doing your bidding, right? He said, I'll do it, but I'll do it at my own time. And you can hold me to account on this. And I'm going to deliver on all of it. And he went through it, and he has, more or less. And I learned a lesson there, because I realized then, the showmanship that occurs in public is not a good indicator. That most of the time you need to sit with the one-on-one and then say, look, let's understand. And then what I did is, when I had a press conference, I wound down what it is that I was planning to say, to give them the space. So we can learn. But this idea that, so one day Alex will work together, and I hope I can do some progress.
Sadly, we could really continue this discussion long into the...
Sorry, and on the Westphalian piece,
yes.
We tried it in terms of Syria at the Munich Security Conference as a representation from Cambridge, and it was introduced into a dialogue with our colleague Stefan de Mistura.
That's the project.
That's right, and all of us thought it was a highly intelligent project. The problem was, of course, it was preceded by 30 years of war, and 4 years perhaps has not been enough to stimulate the grey cells in the minds of because I think it had great purchase, at least within certain circles within the UN, but then conveying that to the authorities in Damascus or in Moscow and so forth, it becomes more problematic.
We could go on for a long time, and I apologize because there was, I'm sure, some really great questions about to be asked, and we would have had more insight from the answers. But I think the last questions were a great way for us to, let us not say to end the conversation, because I think at least in Cambridge the conversation is just beginning about making and sustaining peace, but it does underline the importance of knowing societies, knowing who runs the societies, who can make change in societies, the kind of human rights defenders that Zeid has talked about who need the support of all of us. And those will be some of the questions, I suppose, that will be explored in this initiative. And could I just end with just a sentence that both of you bring so much experience, but both of you have been through the frustration of knowing some things that if you'd had them, it would have made your job easier and better. Just something to leave with all of these great students of human rights who are with us here tonight, and who by their very presence say they're really concerned about it, something that could help to advance this process. Say?
At times you need help. And just to end on a lighter note, because we've been through so much in the last few weeks, not least the horrific attack in Pittsburgh, and what's been happening, not just there, but so many parts of the world. So one weekend, I was feeling very low, and my family lives in New York, I was in Geneva, and it was just a brutal week in terms of what we were seeing happen around the world. And all of us are affected. I think we all have second stage sort of trauma. And I spoke to my wife, it was about 8 or 9 in the evening, and she could hear that I was in this state, and she said to me, look, your daughter and I have a 9-year-old daughter, she said, we're watching this show, The Great British Bake Off. So she said, why not take your mind off everything and go online and watch one of the episodes, and then you'll feel much better. You call us up tomorrow, and you can talk about it with your daughter. So there I was in Geneva, alone in a small flat, 11 o'clock at night. I finally was watching one of these shows. And then it could get right to the end, and this poor fellow has a few seconds left to get the souffle out, so get it organized, and the countdown has started, and you're sitting there like this. And he pulls the souffle out, and it collapsed. And I wept for at least an hour. I was in such a mess. So, well, I mean, that does need distractions, but maybe the right sorts of
So sending better, more optimistic television programs to human rights envoys.
Well, I hadn't expected my humanitarian experience to be quite so personal. perhaps being a bit serious for a moment, I think that I hope that tonight's meeting and the initiative that flows from it will generate real engagement and will, that collectively we can rediscover what underlay the tremendous motivations and incentives that came out of the terrors of the world wars to produce these amazing contexts with which we can all, with authority, try to deal with member states, as we've discussed, often not adequately. But the world is so rapidly changing, not least because we all have these things, and this is meaning that so much is now happening sort of internalized within nations, within communities. It's not the old sort of member state versus member state competition for power. Everybody is now an agent in their own cause. And I would hope that we can find a way of leading, because I think this is where Cambridge's tremendous expertise, leading the advice that's going to be available to practitioners of goodwill and good intent, can find a way of unearthing what would incentivize people who are in leadership positions, in trust of their people, to be motivated to avert doing the wrong things. I'm not saying they've got to be saints, but I want them to avert causing their own people either death, deprivation, or complete absence of hope. And that seems to me, if we can unearth that, have that in our toolbox, then whether it's the UN or some other form of institution which can ride parallel with it, which is supported by the world community, because we all want every citizen to have the same advantages that we have. We will need to find a way of incentivizing leaders to be measured and acclaimed, and for their legacy to be built on that behavior, not simply the accretion, capture, and retention of power, money, and disadvantage by others.
Just a final postscript. 30 years ago, I was greatly influenced by this extraordinary man who was at Christ, a college I was at, and of course the Master's College, David Nicol. He was from Sierra Leone, this humble man of considerable ability, both in medicine, and he used to teach at Cedric's site as well. And he was president of the Security Council in 1970 when my own country was in civil war, embroiled in civil war. And so he looked at this sort of rather disheveled student from Jordan, and he invited me to go sit in his cottage, and he spoke to me about the UN. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but I think later he sort of made me aware of it as a potential career opportunity. If Stephen O'Brien is here now visiting fellow at Emmanuel, spend time with him, and maybe in the future you too, the students here will also be leading parts of the international community, because it happened to me, and he was an outstanding role model, I think, David Nicol, and has just been celebrated by Cambridge University in its recognition of the great African scholars who emerged from this university.
Ron Williams, you opened it. Did you want to give us a last word to end? Please, it can only be one of hope, please.
We've had a very stretching discussion indeed, I think. And no one will go away from this with any impression other than that this initiative is timely and indeed essential. What it seems we are left with is a very strong reminder of the need for institutions that are resilient, that don't depend on passing political fashion, depend on robust, defensible, comprehensive moral convictions about rights, and which, because of that resilience, are able to step aside from thinking simply that there is an arc of history which will automatically deliver good results. There is no such thing, unfortunately. I speak as a highly pessimistic theologian. But as a theologian, I'm also professionally obliged to be hopeful, which is different from being optimistic. And if we can hold in view that need for institutions with that sort of resilience, that sort of long view, if we can remember that human rights is not simply a set of enforceable claims, but a culture of mutual respect and obligation. And if in this university we can generate that sort of culture, help to produce and to nourish those sorts of institutions, this university will not be a waste of time, nor will the United Nations. I'm sure you'd all want to join me in expressing profound gratitude to our very distinguished speakers who've shared so much, so eloquently, so personally.